Good morning. Thank you all for coming to ILR's 15th Annual Legal Reform Summit. There are a lot of really good friends and allies in the room with us here today. My name is Lisa Ricard, and I'm the president of the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform. We're pleased that you could join us for what we think will be a really informative, jam-packed program, which is why we're trying to stay on time here. I'd like to take a few moments to thank all of those who helped to make today's summit a reality. First, I want to thank our major sponsors, Skadden Arps, Mayer Brown, Hunton & Williams, and Aiken Gump Strauss Hauenfeld. And I'd like to thank our other sponsors as well, Brownstein Hyatt, Dickstein Shapiro, Gray Robinson, the Merck Strategy Group, Shook Hardy and Bacon, Reed Smith, Peck Madigan Jones, Wilmer Hale, Denton's, McKenna Long, and our media sponsor, the Hill newspaper. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank all of my colleagues at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, as well as the ILR staff. A particular thanks go to Oriana Senator, our Vice President for Policy and Research, who's right there. Yay. Nicole Nichols and Michelle Timberlake for helping organize the event. Two quick housekeeping announcements. First, your event ID badge is your day pass for today's activities. Please keep it with you at all times, including going in and out of the restrooms. If you happen to misplace your badge, please go to the front registration desk and we'll get you a new one. Second, you can follow today's summit on Twitter with the hashtag ILR Summit. And throughout the day, we'll be tweeting out information about our panels and the research that we're releasing. I also encourage you to check out our website, instituteforlegalreform.com, as well as our Facebook and LinkedIn pages for more information about what we're going to be discussing today. So with that, on with the show. When I came to ILR over 11 years ago, we focused almost entirely on private civil litigation reform, and we've had many successes in that area working with many of you in this audience. Today, we face an additional challenge that we believe threatens our very system of justice. Enforcement officials at the federal, state, and local levels seem to be on a crusade. They're abusing the enforcement process to promote an ideological agenda, to attract headlines, and to raise revenue for the government in the form of mind-staggering fines and penalties. This perversion of our justice system is undermining core principles that we all hold dear: due process, remedies that should be proportional to the alleged misconduct, and the principle that even the worst offenders should be prosecuted only once, not in perpetuity. Let me be clear, we all support bringing bad actors to justice. That's not what this is about today. But the current state of affairs goes well beyond that. Enforcement officials are serving, in effect, as prosecutor, judge, jury, tax collector, regulator, and legislator, with few, if any, checks on their power. To paraphrase John Adams, we've gone from a nation of laws, not men, to a nation of men, not laws. That's why the summit is focused on the rise of an all-powerful, all-encompassing enforcement regime. And I'd like to start today with a few words about the problem. First of all, how did we get here? Second, why an out-of-control enforcement regime erodes our justice system and harms our economy? And third, what we should do about it. Okay, how did we get here? One of the biggest factors is the unchecked proliferation of civil and criminal laws and regulations. On the criminal front, studies by Professor John Baker of Louisiana State University and the Congressional Research Service estimate that there are nearly 5,000 criminal offenses embedded in federal statutes. And that's just the statutes. the number of regulatory crimes could be as much as 6 times higher. As a result, we have laws on the books to address just about everything. You can be sent to prison for such dangerous offenses as the interstate transport of unlicensed dentures, pretending to be a member of the 4-H club, the unauthorized use of Smokey Bear, or using the slogan, "Give a hoot, don't pollute." In fact, the number of federal offenses has grown so large that even the government has no idea how many there are. If the government cannot keep track, then how are ordinary Americans expected to keep track? To quote James Madison, "It will be of little avail to the people if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood." We've clearly reached that point now, and with new statutory and regulatory crimes created with each passing year, the situation will get even worse. But it's not just the sheer number of laws that's a problem. Government officials have been engaging in legal jujitsu by contorting laws well beyond their original intent. For example, the Supreme Court will soon hear a case involving a Florida fisherman, John Yates. He was charged, listen carefully, with violating a provision in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, passed after the Enron collapse, which aims to prevent document destruction in white-collar criminal cases. But Yates was charged under that provision for the alleged crime of dumping a few undersized fish back into the ocean during a federal inspection. He was convicted and sentenced to jail. Now, I fully get that we sometimes wrap fish in paper at the supermarket, but I find it really hard to believe that Congress, in its wildest imagination, ever intended to treat fish as documents. This is just one example of the many civil and criminal statutes that the government has contorted beyond its limits, and you'll hear about them, more about them, today on some of these panels. So we have an enormous volume of laws, and we have the government contorting them well beyond their intended purpose. Then there's the final factor, what it's all about, money. The settlements resulting from enforcement actions bring in lots and lots of money for all levels of government, but they also incentivize the government to put profits ahead of justice. We saw this mentality on display in a January press release from the Department of Justice. They boasted that the $8.1 billion collected by the department last year was nearly 3 times the $2.8 billion spent on the department's litigation divisions. And they referred to this as a valuable return and a sound investment. Since when is the administration of justice measured in terms of profit and loss? As one former federal prosecutor put it in a news article just last weekend, it's the Department of Justice, not the Department of Revenue. The temptation to raise revenue through litigation can be even greater for some state attorneys general. In many cases, the revenues from settlements are directly earmarked to their offices or pet programs. They also hire outside plaintiffs' lawyers to represent the state on a contingency fee basis, creating an additional layer of self-interested profiteering. So it's easy to see why some enforcement officials like the current system. They can derive great benefits, both monetarily and politically. And that sums up pretty much how we got here. Which brings me to my next point, why an out-of-control enforcement regime erodes our justice system and the American economy. As Americans, we all take pride in a legal system that delivers impartial justice and due process. But the current system often disregards both. To quote The Economist magazine in a recent article, The formula is simple. Find a large company that may or may not have done something wrong, threaten its managers with commercial ruin, preferably criminal charges, force them to use their shareholders' money to pay an enormous fine to drop the charges, and then repeat with another large company. The state of affairs has little resemblance to what we learned in our junior high civics classes, but it is the system we have today. And the government is able to pull it off because it can realistically threaten commercial ruin of a company. Remember Arthur Andersen. Its criminal conviction was later overturned by a unanimous Supreme Court. But by the time that happened, the company had already collapsed. Other companies want to avoid the same fate. They want to avoid being barred from all government contract work, an outcome that would certainly put many companies out of business. They want to avoid massive statutory penalties like those we read about on the front page every day. Severe penalties might be justified in cases of intentional, systemic wrongdoing by a company or its leadership. But many criminal and civil statutes don't require any proof of intent. A study by the Heritage Foundation and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers found that of the new crimes enacted in one recent session of Congress, fully 1/4 lacked any intent requirement. So the government is able to threaten what can be a corporate death penalty, even when senior management had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. With those risks, what rational CEO would fight the government? As a result, they agree to massive settlements negotiated not in a courtroom, but in what amounts to a modern-day star chamber. Instead of public trials before judges and juries, we have the enforcement agencies serving as prosecutor, judge, and jury all in one. In fact, the SEC recently announced that it will bring fewer cases in court and more before its own administrative law panels, where they can determine the prosecutors, the judges, and the procedural rules. And if the defendant doesn't like the outcome, they can appeal, you guessed it, to the SEC. There's an article about this today in the Wall Street Journal, in fact. Enforcers are also using their leverage to moonlight as legislators and regulators. They've used settlements and deferred prosecution agreements to force companies to follow new policies that haven't gotten through Congress or the regulatory process. For example, the government used the recent $25 billion mortgage settlement to impose new restrictions on banks. It created an entirely new office in DOJ to regulate the banks with no participation whatsoever or input from Congress. This is despite the fact that at least a half a dozen other federal agencies already regulate the banking industry. This would all be bad enough if businesses only had to deal with one enforcement agency. But increasingly, companies are being targeted for the same alleged offense repeatedly from one or more federal agencies, one or more state attorneys general, and one or more private civil actions from entrepreneurial plaintiffs' lawyers. We're calling this perpetual prosecution. The end result is companies facing years of costly, often politically motivated litigation with no end in sight. For example, one major drug company was accused of improperly marketing a drug. It paid over $2 billion to settle with the federal government and most states. But other states, including Arkansas, Louisiana, and South Carolina, brought their own cases using outside contingency fee counsel. And surprise, surprise, many of those plaintiffs' lawyers were also large campaign contributors to the AGs who hired them. Cases like these bring in lots of revenue and publicity for the states, but they also undermine the principle that an alleged offender should be punished only once, not in perpetuity. Isn't that what the Fifth Amendment was for, to prevent double jeopardy? The huge penalties, lack of due process, and perpetual prosecutions all erode the integrity of our justice system. They also harm our global economic competitiveness. In today's global economy, businesses have more options about where to do business than ever before. And when deciding where to do business, they certainly consider a country's legal system. On that count, the U.S. clearly faces challenges. In a survey of Global Corporate Counsel by the Hogan Lovells Law Firm, the U.S. legal system was rated as the most challenging in the world for litigation, behind countries like China, Brazil, and India. The recent spate of massive penalties is only making these perceptions worse. The French government, with the support of Germany, the UK, and Italy, even wants the issue of excessive penalties added to the agenda of next month's G20 summit in Australia. I've heard myself personally from general counsels of non-US based companies that say that they're considering reducing their American footprints due to an out-of-control enforcement regime and perpetual prosecutions. So it's time to consider a new course of action. What should we do about these problems? Well, that's why we're here today. This is not a situation that developed overnight, and we won't be able to fix it overnight, but we clearly need to begin a discussion about how to fix the broken system. Here are a few places we should start. First, the coercion, the threats, and the extortion must stop. We can start by ensuring that monetary penalties are proportionate to alleged misconduct. Second, the perpetual prosecution problem must end as well. One option would be to limit enforcement of any one case to a lead enforcement agency. In addition, we need to contain the profiteering by outside contingency fee counsel hired by state officials who bring related enforcement actions. Third, we really need to change our criminal laws. Most importantly, we must establish a clear intent requirement for all crimes. This idea was presented to a bipartisan congressional task force and has attracted interest from members, and we're really pleased to see that they're reviewing this. As the last few years have taught us, an all-powerful, all-encompassing enforcement regime violates the principles upon which this country was founded. To restore justice and due process, we must once again make America a nation of laws and not men. The goal of today's summit is to start a national dialogue on how to do just that. We hope that you'll walk out of the building today committed to join us in our effort. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas throughout the day today and in the weeks to come. So thank you very much.